The stage lights flickered, bathing the Detroit concert hall in a glow that felt almost otherworldly. The crowd roared, their voices merging into a tidal wave of sound that rose and crashed with every note Chris Cornell delivered. His voice was not just singing, it was a haunting instrument, raw and infinite, a sound that reached into the marrow of the bones of everyone who listened. To the world, it looked like a night of triumph. A sold-out crowd, a legendary voice still carrying the weight of decades, and a man who seemed larger than life. But within hours, that same man would be found lifeless, and the world would be left with questions that still echo today. Questions that feel less like answers and more like whispers in the shadows. Chris Cornell was not just a singer. He was a force. From the depths of the Seattle grunge movement to the polished stages of international fame, his story was one of survival, reinvention, and pain. Behind the long hair, the piercing blue eyes, and the kind smile was a soul that carried storms. He sang about darkness because he lived inside it. He wrote about loss because it followed him. And he screamed about pain because sometimes it was the only way he knew how to be heard. The night of May 17th, 2017, was supposed to be another stop on a tour. Another chance for fans to lose themselves in that otherworldly sound. Cornell walked off the stage, bowed one last time, and disappeared backstage. To the audience, it felt like the end of a perfect performance. But what no one could have predicted was that those final notes would become his last farewell. In a hotel room only blocks away, something happened that would change the legacy of Chris Cornell forever. The official reports claimed suicide. A man alone with his demons, swallowed whole by depression and medication. But for many, the story didn't sit right. Too many details felt off. Too many contradictions swirled around his final hours. And so, a new story began, one of mystery, doubt, and suspicion. But before we can unravel those final chilling moments, we need to step back, to trace the path of the boy who became the voice of a generation. Born in Seattle in 1964, Christopher John Boyle, who would later take his mother's maiden name, Cornell grew up in a world already fractured. His father was a pharmacist, his mother an accountant, but their home was not filled with stability. Chris was one of 6 children, and early on, he felt the weight of something most kids don't, the crushing silence of isolation. By the time he was 10, he had already tasted the bitter edges of depression. At 30, he discovered something that would change him forever. The first time he heard the Beatles, it wasn't just sound, it was salvation. In their harmonies, he found a map out of the shadows. In their lyrics, he found a voice for the feelings that burned inside him. Soon, he picked up drums, later guitar, and finally, he found his true gift, his voice. A voice that could shift from a gentle whisper to a scream that shattered the air. It wasn't just singing. It was confession, release, therapy, and destruction all at once. But Chris's journey into music wasn't an easy climb. His teenage years were marked by substance abuse, crushing anxiety, and a retreat from the outside world. He barely went to school, spending much of his time locked inside, avoiding people. He once confessed that he didn't leave his house for over a year. It was as if the world was too much for him, too sharp, too loud. Yet in that cocoon of isolation, his craft grew. He learned to transform pain into sound, loneliness into melody, despair into art. By the early 1980s, the Seattle music scene was about to explode. Punk was fading, and something darker, heavier, and more primal was brewing. Out of dingy clubs and basements, a new sound emerged. Bands like Nirvana, Pearl Jam, and Alice in Chains would become its flag bearers. But before them, there was Soundgarden, and at the heart of it stood Chris Cornell. His towering presence, shirtless frame, and hair cascading like a lion's mane made him look almost mythic. But it was his voice, a 4-octave range that could both caress and annihilate, that set him apart. Soundgarden wasn't just another band. They were architects of a movement. Their music was heavy, complex, and unrelenting, yet threaded with vulnerability. Cornell's lyrics spoke of existential dread, of inner wars, of the kind of darkness that lurked beneath everyday life. Songs like Black Hole Sun and Fell on Black Days became anthems, not because they were easy to digest, but because they said what so many were too afraid to admit. Yet even as the world worshipped him, Chris was haunted. Fame brought pressure, expectation, and more isolation. Drugs and alcohol became both his escape and his cage. He struggled through the 1990s, caught between success and self-destruction. Friends later described him as a man constantly at war with himself, someone who could dazzle a crowd of thousands yet retreat into silence when the lights went. Outthought by the mid-2000s, after the breakup of Soundgarden, Cornell seemed reborn. He launched a solo career, dabbled in different genres, and even fronted Audioslave, a supergroup with members of Rage Against the Machine. Their sound was explosive, revolutionary, and filled with fury. Once again, Chris's voice carried it beyond music, into something spiritual, almost prophetic. But even in the midst of this rebirth, the shadows never left. Depression doesn't vanish. It lingers. It waits. And sometimes, it disguises itself as success. Those close to Cornell often described him as gentle, kind, and deeply empathetic. He wasn't the stereotypical rock star, drunk on ego and chaos. He was soft-spoken, thoughtful, and almost shy. But behind that gentleness, there was fragility. His songs revealed it more than his interviews ever could. The lyrics read like cries for help, like pages ripped from a diary no one was meant to read. On that final night in Detroit, when he sang "In My Time of Dying," the audience cheered, not realizing that the words carried a haunting foreshadowing. When he sang about the darkness and the end, fans thought it was a performance. They didn't know it was a prophecy. Hours later, the police would find him in his hotel room, and the narrative would fracture into two versions: the official one, and the one whispered in the corners of the internet. The one murmured by fans and friends who still can't make peace with the idea that Chris Cornell's story ended the way they said it did, because maybe it didn't. Maybe there's more. Maybe his voice was silenced by something other than his own hand. And that, Azaz, is where the first part closes the man, the legend, the final night on stage, and the shadows that followed him into that Detroit hotel room. But the truth of what happened next, that's where the real mystery begins. The clock inside the MGM Grand Detroit ticked past midnight. Outside, the city buzzed faintly with the afterglow of 1,000 conversations from the concert that had just ended. Fans spilled into bars and parking lots, still humming the echoes of the songs they had witnessed, not knowing that in a high-rise suite above them, a final act was unfolding in silence. Chris Cornell walked into his hotel room just after 11:30 p.m. The cameras in the lobby had captured his tall frame, head bowed, moving with the slow heaviness of someone carrying invisible chains. To the untrained eye, it was routine, just another performer retreating to solitude after a long show. But those who would later pore over those final images saw something else. He looked exhausted, yes, but also unsettled, almost dazed. His bodyguard, Martin Kirsten, followed behind. Martin was more than just security. He was a shadow, a witness to Cornell's private world. He recalled Chris complaining of feeling groggy, of having taken an extra Ativan, a prescription sedative that quieted nerves but dulled clarity. It was a detail that would later become the linchpin in the official narrative, the explanation authorities leaned on. A little pill, a heavy burden, and a man too tired to resist the storm inside his head. But was it really that simple? As Chris closed the door to his suite, the world outside carried on oblivious. Fans left voice messages to friends, telling them about the unforgettable night. Twitter lit up with praise, clips of the performance already going viral. In those first hours, Chris Cornell was alive in the digital afterglow, a legend reborn through pixels and soundbites. But the man himself was slipping away, along with thoughts no one else could hear. At 12:15 a.m., Vicky Cornell, his wife, called him. They often spoke after shows, a ritual that kept them tethered despite distance. But this call was different. She later described his words as slurred, his tone unsettling. "I'm just tired," he said, before abruptly hanging up. Concern flared in her chest. Something wasn't right. She dialed again. No answer. Again, silence. Her unease grew into panic, and she called Martin, instructing him to check on Chris immediately. When Martin forced the door open, the room was eerily quiet, a kind of silence that screams louder than any noise. In the bathroom, he found him. Chris Cornell, the man whose voice had filled arenas, now lifeless on the floor. A red exercise band hung from the door. His skin was pale, his eyes closed. It was an image that would etch itself into Martin's memory forever, a moment both surreal and unbearable. The police arrived swiftly. They treated the scene as suicide. The narrative wrote itself quickly. Depression, medication, a late-night decision fueled by despair. Within hours, the news broke, and fans around the world were stunned. Social media flooded with grief. Hashtags trended. Tributes poured in from musicians, actors, and ordinary people who had once found solace in his songs. The story was set, stamped, and circulated. Chris Cornell had taken his own life, but not everyone believed it. Vicky Cornell was among the first to raise questions. He was not suicidal, she insisted in interviews. She pointed to the Ativan, to the grogginess he mentioned on the phone, to the slurred speech. She believed the drug had altered his mind, stripped away his will, left him vulnerable to impulses he would never have acted on sober. Others took her words further, weaving theories of foul play. Why had the bodyguard left him alone? Why had the timeline shifted in small but suspicious ways? Why did certain reports seem inconsistent, as if details were being smoothed over? Fans dissected everything. The coroner's report, the toxicology findings, even the grainy photos of the hotel suite door. Online forums became battlegrounds between those who accepted the official ruling and those who demanded a deeper look. Theories grew. Was it an accidental overdose? A stage scene? Was Chris Cornell silenced because of what he knew, because of causes he supported, because of truths too dangerous to speak aloud? His death didn't feel like closure. It felt like the opening of a wound. And so the story became bigger than one man. It became a mirror reflecting society's uneasy relationship with mental health, fame, and the shadows of the music industry. Some saw a tragedy of a tortured artist finally overcome by his demons. Others saw the fingerprints of something darker, a conspiracy that stretched beyond one hotel room in Detroit. But whichever story you chose to believe, one thing remained undeniable. Chris Cornell was gone, and the silence he left behind was deafening. Yet even in that silence, questions lingered. His friends described him as upbeat in the days before his death, excited about new projects, looking forward to seeing his children. The set list of that final show didn't read like a goodbye. He had even tweeted hours before walking on stage, sending out a simple message. #Detroit finally went back to Rock City. It didn't sound like the words of a man planning an exit. So what really happened in those final minutes? The hotel room was sealed, the autopsy complete, the media moving on. But for those who loved him, who sang his lyrics in dark bedrooms, who believed in the catharsis of his music, the story wasn't over. It had only just begun. Because behind every official report lies the possibility of something unseen, something untold. And in Chris Cornell's case, that possibility refuses to die dot. As the years passed, tributes continued. Murals of his face appeared in cities around the world. Candlelight vigils drew thousands. His voice played on car radios and streaming apps, immortal and untouchable. But whispers followed his memory too. Whispers that maybe, just maybe, the truth about that night in Detroit was not as simple as they'd wanted us to believe. And if it wasn't, then who or what silenced Chris Cornell? The answer may never be found. But in mystery, in shadow, his legacy only grows stronger, pulling us deeper into the labyrinth of his life, his music, and his final night. The morning after his death, headlines screamed across the globe. Rock legend Chris Cornell dead at 52. To the world, it was another tragic loss in the long line of musicians gone too soon. But to those who knew him and to countless fans who couldn't reconcile the official story, it was the beginning of questions that refused to fade. The coroner's report was clear. Cause of death, suicide by hanging. Toxicology revealed Ativan, barbiturates, caffeine, and a small trace of other substances in his system. None, they claimed, lethal enough to kill him directly. The conclusion was simple. The combination dulled his judgment, and the act was his own. But simplicity often hides complexity, and in the case of Chris Cornell, too much felt wrong. His wife, Vicky, became the loudest voice of dissent. She knew her husband, knew his struggles, but she also knew his plans. He had been excited about their children, their future, his music. Hours before the show, he had spoken of recording again, of new horizons. He had even taken to social media with enthusiasm. None of it matched the profile of a man plotting his own death. Vicky pointed to Ativan, the sedative often prescribed for anxiety. Chris had a prescription, but the pills came with warnings. They could cause paranoia, suicidal thoughts, even psychotic episodes. She believed the overdose of Ativan was not intentional self-destruction, but chemical manipulation. A man altered against his will, but for some, even that explanation didn't go far enough. They began to connect dots that stretched beyond the man himself. Chris Cornell wasn't just a musician, he was also a philanthropist, a voice for the voiceless. Alongside his wife, he had founded the Chris and Vicky Cornell Foundation, focusing on protecting vulnerable children from abuse and trafficking. He had raised money, given time, and spoken openly against the exploitation of children worldwide. To conspiracy theorists, this was the key. They whispered of secrets too dark for the mainstream. That Cornell was not merely a singer with depression, but a man who had seen too much. That he had planned to expose a network, to name names, to shine a light where shadows had long thrived. And that his death was no accident of despair, but an execution disguised as suicide. Online forums erupted, drawing parallels to other celebrities and activists who had died suddenly while working on similar causes. Was Chris silenced because of what he knew, or because of what he was about to reveal? Skeptics dismissed these theories as wild speculation, born from grief and paranoia. But the details that didn't quite add up continued to fuel suspicion. Why was the timeline of his bodyguard's actions so inconsistent? Why were there small changes in police statements and reports that trickled out in the days after? Why was the red band used in his death one that seemed oddly placed, almost staged? Each inconsistency became fuel for the fire, each unanswered question a spark that kept a conspiracy alive. Meanwhile, friends within the music industry offered their own doubts. Some described Chris as happy, sober, focused in the days leading up to Detroit. Tom Morello, his Audioslave bandmate, recalled Cornell's excitement for the future. Others, like Chester Bennington of Linkin Park, his close friend, were devastated. Chester himself would die under eerily similar circumstances just 2 months later on Chris's birthday. For many, the parallel was too chilling to ignore. Two rock legends, two suicides by hanging, both connected by friendship and grief. Coincidence or something more sinister? As weeks turned into months, tributes for Cornell multiplied. His voice echoed in memorial concerts, murals, and public vigils. Yet, in the same breath, the mystery surrounding his death only deepened. Theories spread like wildfire across social media. Some spoke of foul play, others of pharmaceutical negligence, and some of vast conspiracies stretching into hidden corridors of power. The truth was drowned in noise, but one thing remained clear. The world was not ready to let go of Chris Cornell. The man who once sang of Black Hole Sun seemed to have been swallowed by one himself, a void of unanswered questions, endless speculation, and grief that refused to settle. Fans revisited his lyrics, combing them for clues, searching for messages hidden in plain sight. Every song became a prophecy, every line a confession. And yet, was that fair? Or was it the cruel irony of art that when an artist dies tragically, every word they ever wrote becomes a mirror of their demise? Still, the whispers continued. Some believed Cornell had been targeted because of his activism. Others saw in his death the fingerprints of the darker side of fame where money, drugs, and exploitation intertwine. And some believed it truly was what the report said, a man battling lifelong demons, overcome in a vulnerable moment. But what if the truth lies not in one story, but in the intersection of them all? Chris Cornell lived with depression since childhood, battled addiction, and yet found light through music. He was not immune to relapse, nor untouched by the pull of despair. But he was also a fighter, a father, a husband, and a visionary. He had plans, dreams, and battles still to fight. And that contradiction, that impossibility of fitting his death into a single narrative, is what keeps the mystery alive. The hotel room in Detroit has long been cleaned. The echoes of that night erased from its walls. But for millions of fans, the mystery lingers like smoke. Was it despair? Was it drugs? Was it silence forced upon a man who refused to stay quiet? The answers remain locked away, buried with Chris Cornell himself. And so, his story does not end with his death. It lingers in the notes of his songs, and the questions we continue to ask, and the conspiracies we chase late at night. His voice, immortal, still sings. But the silence around his final moments speaks louder, Doug, because sometimes the greatest mysteries aren't in the music. They're in the lives of the people who create it. The funeral was a spectacle of sorrow and reverence. On May 26, 2017, Hollywood Forever Cemetery became the stage for a farewell unlike any other. Fans lined the streets, clutching flowers, photographs, and lyrics scribbled on scraps of paper. Inside, family, friends, and legends of rock gathered beneath the Californian sun to honor the man whose voice had defined a generation. Chester Bennington stood among them, his voice trembling as he sang Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah. The performance was raw, painful, as though every note carried the weight of a friendship cut short. No one knew that within weeks, Chester himself would fall to the same fate, his death forever linking him to Chris in a bond of tragedy that still unsettles the soul. The music world mourned, but mourning soon gave way to reflection, and reflection to obsession. Tributes painted Chris as a gentle soul, a man who gave more than he took, who carried his pain in silence so others might be freed by his art. But in the corners of the internet, forums buzzed with theories, questions, and suspicions. Why Detroit? Why that night? Why the eerie parallels to other mysterious deaths? Each theory layered atop the next, until Cornell's final hours felt less like an isolated tragedy and more like a chapter in an unfinished book of shadows in Seattle. His hometown, murals bloomed across brick walls, towering images of his face staring out like a guardian watching over the city that had birthed him. Fans left candles, letters, and guitars at memorials, They spoke not just of a musician, but of a savior, someone whose lyrics had pulled them back from the edge, whose voice had been the only thing that made sense in the dark. The irony stung. The man who had saved so many could not be saved himself. Or perhaps, as some believed, he had been stolen from them. Chris Cornell continued to fight, not only for answers, but also for his legacy. She spoke publicly about addiction, about the dangers of prescription medication, about the need to protect artists and ordinary people alike from the silent claws of mental illness. To her, Chris's death was not simply suicide, it was the byproduct of a broken system, a culture too quick to medicate, too slow to understand. Yet, even as she sought justice and awareness, she too was haunted by the same questions. How could a man so full of plans vanish so suddenly, so violently? The connection to Chester Bennington only deepened the mystery. Chester, too, had been outspoken about abuse, trauma, and survival. His death, by hanging on what would have been Chris Cornell's 53rd birthday, felt less like coincidence and more like an echo. For conspiracy theorists, it was confirmation. Two voices silenced. Two men linked by friendship and cause. Their deaths staged as suicides, but carrying the scent of something darker. Whether truth or imagination, the parallel became a story too powerful to ignore. As time passed, the world tried to heal. Cornell's children carried his legacy. His foundation continued its work. His songs refused to fade from playlists and airwaves. Each new generation discovered Black Hole Sun, like a stone, fell on black days, and found themselves tangled in the same web of awe and melancholy. His voice impossible, unearthly, unforgettable outlived him, immortalized not just in recordings, but in the hearts of millions. And yet, the mystery never left. At candlelight vigils, fans whispered theories between tears. Online, strangers debated over the coroner's findings and photographs. Some insisted he had simply lost his battle with depression. Others swore he had been silenced for reasons too big to name. The truth remained locked in that Detroit hotel room, sealed in silence, leaving only fragments for the world to puzzle over. Even now, years later, the story of Chris Cornell reads less like a biography and more like a haunting. A man of immense talent, born into darkness, who carved beauty from pain, only to be swallowed by shadows in the end. His legacy is not just in his songs, but in the questions he left behind. Questions that refuse to rest, because perhaps Chris Cornell was more than just another rock star gone too soon. Perhaps he was a mirror, reflecting the fragility of all of us, the battle between light and darkness, between survival and surrender. And perhaps that is why his death still feels unfinished, as though we are all waiting for one more note, one more truth, one more revelation to bring the story to its end. But the end never comes. Only echoes, only questions, only the ghost of a voice that still sings when the night grows too quiet. Chris Cornell remains, even in death, a mystery. A song half finished, a story without a final chapter, a legend whose silence speaks louder than any scream. And maybe that's the cruelest, most beautiful truth of all. The years after Chris Cornell's death were filled with tributes, memorials, and endless speculation. His name became not only a reminder of grunge's golden era, but also a symbol of the fragility of genius. Each anniversary brought fans back to that night in Detroit, back to the haunting image of a man walking off stage for the last time. And with every passing year, the questions grew louder. His foundation carried on its work, raising awareness about child abuse and human trafficking. Those efforts, ironically, became a point of contention in the theories that surrounded his death. Some argued that he had been silenced because of what he was uncovering, because he was shining a light on darkness too vast, too dangerous. Others believed his activism had nothing to do with it, that it was his lifelong battle with depression that had finally consumed him. The two narratives clashed endlessly, and yet neither brought peace. Musicians who had once shared the stage with him continued to speak of his talent in reverent tones. Eddie Vedder, Pearl Jam's enigmatic frontman, could barely speak of Cornell without his voice breaking. He admitted that he avoided even listening to Chris's music because the pain was too sharp. Others, like Tom Morello, spoke of him as more than a bandmate. He was a brother, a philosopher, a man who carried wisdom beyond his years. Their grief was raw, and it painted a picture of someone loved deeply, respected universally, and missed immeasurably, but grief as a way of becoming an obsession. Fans pored over every interview Chris had ever given, every lyric he had ever written. They sought patterns, hidden meanings, prophecies. Songs like a Stone or The Day I Tried to Live took on sinister new meanings. What was once art became evidence. What was once poetry became testimony. And yet, in this desperate search for answers, perhaps the truth of his artistry was being overshadowed by the mystery of his death. Still, the shadows remained. Chester Bennington's death added fuel to the fire, creating a narrative too strange to ignore. Two men, bonded by friendship, both gone by hanging, both celebrated for their raw honesty about mental health, both tied to activism that challenged dangerous powers. Fans could not shake the feeling that something larger was at play, that these were not isolated tragedies, but chapters in a hidden story. Meanwhile, Chris's family continued to fight in his name. His widow Vicky brought lawsuits against his doctor, arguing that the overprescription of Ativan had played a direct role in his death. She believed negligence had robbed the world of her husband. She wanted accountability, not only for Chris, but for countless others whose lives had been derailed by powerful drugs handed out too freely. The case dragged on, another reminder that Chris's story was far from finished, that even in death he was a catalyst for change. But beneath the lawsuits, the theories, the tributes, and the grief lay something deeper, a legacy that could not be erased. Chris Cornell's voice continues to ripple across generations, its resonance undimmed by time. His songs remain as raw and haunting today as they were the day they were written. His lyrics continue to offer solace to those lost in their own darkness. And maybe, in the end, that is what matters most. Not the unanswered questions, not the official reports or whispered conspiracies, but the enduring gift of his music. Still, the mystery clings to his memory like smoke to a flame. His death feels unsolved, even if officially closed. The world wants to know what really happened in that Detroit hotel room, what really silenced one of rock's most powerful voices. And perhaps we never will. Perhaps the truth is locked away, hidden beneath layers of silence and grief. Or perhaps the truth is simpler than we want it to be. A man, a father, a husband, a musician, simply overwhelmed by demons too heavy to carry. But here lies the paradox. The very ambiguity of his death is what keeps him alive in the hearts of millions. If the story had been clean, the chapter closed neatly, maybe his legacy would feel less eternal. Instead, the questions give his memory the same haunting power as his songs. Chris Cornell is not just remembered, he's mythologized, suspended forever in the space between brilliance and tragedy, between life and death, between answers and shadows. And so his story endures, not as a completed tale, but as a mystery still unfolding. Every time a fan presses play, every time his voice cuts through the silence, the questions return. Who was Chris Cornell in those final hours? Was he a man succumbing to despair, or a man silenced by something darker? Was his death a tragic accident of chemistry and circumstance, or the result of forces that will never be named? The truth may be forever out of reach, but the mystery that will never die. And so, Chris Cornell's story closes, not with answers, but with echoes. His voice immortal, his death unresolved. A legend lost to the shadows, leaving behind not certainty, but questions that may never be answered. Was it despair, or was it silence forced upon him? The world may never know. But one truth remains. Chris Cornell is gone, and yet his voice still haunts the night.